Welcome to the Chaosmos. And in Unrehearsed Futures, in its third season, in its 13th or 14th episode of the third season, I think if we did a number, I think we're close to the 100 episode mark, if not past it. I suppose we should commemorate that. And like everything, it started with great intentionality. It started with a purpose and a focus uh, that came out of a very fixed status of the pandemic being the pandemic and all of us being locked in our rooms. And so we kind of had a stability within which to create this thing to answer very specific questions. And many of you have come and gone and come back again, and we love it. And it's so great to have this small conversational room, because this is us actually trying to say we really want to have a serious conversation about something specific. And maybe we need the people in the room are the right people for this, because you chose to show up. So thank you. But like everything else, dissipation happened, entropy happened, and it at one level one could make the mistake of saying this is a group of people who are doggedly holding space and time through something that is dissipating as we went back to the real world, as Zoom sort of became less and less relevant, and as we all went back to our in-person spaces. But and you could make the mistake of saying, oh, each event with less and less people or something is some kind of detritus, aftermath, after echo of the original plan. But that is so not true. And if you just look deeper one level, you will see that there is a very deliberate investigation going on right now, but one that accepts the fact that everything around us is in perpetual turmoil and chaos. And something that came off, and I'm speaking about even the chaos of programming and the chaos of trying to curate this thing, because Amy and Genny and all of us are coming up against interesting sort of roadblocks and challenges of trying to get people in the room, interlocutors in the room, and yet we seem to roll and say, nope, we'll still have the event and we'll still have a conversation. And last week, the conversation was, I was the person in the chair, and I was just speaking about what I imagined theater could be. And I spoke about Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy and this notion that he created this foundation. The galactic empire was collapsing, and it was the end of the galaxy as we know it. And Asimov's response was to get the galactic emperor to fund a foundation in the hope that it would stop the civilization, the civilizational galactic dark ages to come, would instead of being 100,000 years, would only be 1,000 years, because of deliberate planning, deliberate planting of seeds just before the fall of the collapse of the galactic empire. And that was the story. And the Foundation trilogy is a narrative of that 1,000-year interregnum and how Foundation actually worked. And Foundation's big secret weapon was something called psychohistory, which was this collection of it was like a science of mass movement, a science of mass people, how masses behave psychologically. And it didn't work at the individual level, but it worked at the mass level. So we could say how the mob would work, how a planet of 1 billion people would work, something like that. And in that also there was these thoughts and the proposition that theater is potentially, could theater be our psychohistory? Could theater be the magic thing? And I talk about theater as knowledge, theater as practice, theater as some participatory something that holds communities together, that could potentially put the dēmos back in democracy. We all have lived experiences of what theater has done for us as individuals. We have lived experiences of what theater has done for us as social beings, has done for circles, has done for community. We know its power. And yet, is there a way of reimagining theater as a knowledge system, theater as a practice system, theater as a movement, theater as manifesto? I don't know. For how can it go into the world? And I come up with two analogies. One is the way that yoga is a great movement for individual well-being, but at a holistic level. It unites breath, body, mind. It centers you, it slows you down. Yoga is just a great practice. Can theater be the equivalent of yoga? Yoga for the individual, can theater be the community equivalent? Can it be the community version of yoga, the social being version of yoga? I think of the work of Boal. I'll put another couple of quick propositions down into the mix, and then we can get into the ideation of it if we believe these premises, because these were the premises that were posited in the previous talk last week or week before last, which is if theater can be these things. I think about the Parsis, a very small group of people who migrated from Iran, from then Persia, to flee the Islamic sort of transformation of Persia from Zoroastrianism, the fall of the Persian Empire, and they came to India. And the king, they landed in Gujarat, which is a state a couple of 100 miles north of where I am right now, Mumbai. They landed on the coast of Gujarat, and they looked for asylum and refuge. And the king presented the priest, the head priest, who came requesting refuge, a goblet full of milk, all the way to the point that the meniscus was showing. And if you added one more drop of milk, it would overflow. And he said, the people are my milk, this cup is my kingdom. If I add one more drop of people in, it's going to spill over. We don't have room. And the priest requested a handful of sugar, and he took the sugar and he just gently did this and sort of sprinkled it in, and it just went in. The meniscus didn't break, the cup didn't fall. And he said, now please taste the milk. And the milk was sweet. And the king and the priest said, we are the sugar. Our presence will sweeten it. And it's a great story for immigrants, but I'm just wondering about, can theater be this sugar in the movement? Can theater be this thing? And the other one that I want to do is that we all think about the healthcare status of a nation, and we look at how many doctors per capita. Can we look at how many can we look at how many social engineers, or how many participatory theater makers, theater social engineers, theater-based social engineers per capita, arts and cultural producers, but people who are not just making theater as product, or as art and culture as product, but art and culture as something that you participate in. And so all of this took us to this idea of foundation, Asimov's foundation. What would this foundation look like? What could this foundation have in it? What would it need to do? What are the questions? And Ngeni was starting to frame it, so I think I will hand it over to Ngeni over here. But like, how do we imagine foundation? What is the problem statement that we are trying to design for, in which the impact that we know theater can have can be there for everyone as a ubiquitous part of the human experience, so that our mobs are enlightened ones. Our, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, and the mob will go in unison, we see what you're doing.
Nothing Latin mob, child. Thanks, Jehan. Yeah, so I mean, as Jehan's already laid out, I guess part of the objective of this conversation, but of Unrehearsed Futures more broadly, has seemed to sit only in the space of just continuing these conversations going. But at some point, we started talking about and recognized that there is potentially a lot of value and maybe even a need to begin thinking in much more practical terms, right? How all these insights that we've gained over the past couple of years of this conversation happening, generative in the sense that we can mobilize them to, ironically, begin to rehearse what a future paradigm might look like, unrehearsed though it may be. So the idea being, if we, as we do, right, take seriously the idea that theater, performance are tools, they're ways of engaging with the world that produce real effects, right? They do things. How do we create potentially or imagine a structure that we can use either as to develop teaching tools, to develop some kind of central space where we begin to kind of shape out the practicalities of how one might use these tools to imagine the world that Jehan is talking about. So today's conversation is really about that, is if we were to imagine a foundation of the sort that Isaac Asimov imagines in his trilogy, The Imagined One, that fulfills the same sort of function, that helps us to engage politically with the world, that produces systems, models for how to teach, how to practice, in ways that produce these more generative community formations that we're interested in. I mean, last season was about planetarity, which in some ways asked us to shift our imagining of human societies and our connection to one another beyond the geopolitical, beyond the kind of capitalistic notion that relates us to where we're placed in the power that we enjoy, and to really kind of move towards a more planetary orientation. So how, for example, does the planetary affect our imagining of theatre as a kind of pedagogy, theatre as a system of knowledge, theatre as a mode of transmission? And this is all towards, I think, in the big dream is ultimately maybe creating something like a foundation, like a school, a transnational kind of formation of people who do this work, emerging out of these conversations. So it is relatively open-ended, and we're hoping, to get input from everyone, thinking out loud, dreaming out loud, contesting the terms of that dream. This is all within the scope of the conversation we're going to have today. So I guess maybe that's as good a place as any to start. Is how do we imagine or think about theatre or performance more broadly conceived as a space that we can strategically lay a hold of to begin doing this really important kind of higher order political, social, political, cultural work, but in ways that are grounded in coming together, whether in live encounters or like this even, right? But in that are founded in sharing space and really pushing at what it means to kind of create these communities of practice. And as my colleague Sarah would say, these communities of care, right? Jehan, you had a concept which you called the banyan tree, that keeps on emerging in our conversations. And I wonder if it might be useful for you to kind of throw that out there as well as a potential, grounding concept for how this thing might work.
Okay. Before I do that though, just please know this is not a conversation between Camille and me with Amy and Moini as interjections. It is for all of you. So the real interest here is to see that, these provocations, what questions what questions take shape or are born in your head that you want to throw into the room? Because I almost feel like I just have a litany of questions right now that I would like to start answering, but it's more like still listing out questions instead of answers. So that's also okay. So feel free to just really jump in with anything. Very briefly, the concept of banyan was just me reimagining how theater could impact at scale, at a planetary level versus a globalized level, like planetarity being the Spivak's version, which is grassroots up. We recognize the planet and it builds that way, versus globalization being this neoliberal top-down idea of the planet coming together in a more homogeneous kind of way. And Banyan just imagined this idea of a canopy over the planet, the canopy being this idea of foundation possibly, and the roots coming down in different locations, but then being very specific, context specific to the locations it came down at. I've been since told by a theater agriculturalist botanist person that nothing grows under a banyan. So my analogy might fail at that point in time. Nothing else grows under a banyan. So it might be another fascist hegemonic move on my part. But I will say this, the idea was that these sites would exist. This was a loose idea of a drama school that was designed to build theater makers as social engineers and add to the number of these people in a population so that they can hold space and build community, etc. And the idea was that at each of these locations, there would be faculty, but the faculty would also be connected digitally, and there would be a faculty body that is global, that is planetary, and all contributing. But then what would happen pedagogically at each site would be something that was unique and authored by the people at that site, because it would have the local context of those students and those faculty members, but still being enriched and nourished in different ways by people from across the world. So it was like planetary exposure to a central set of ideas that speak to our humanity, that speak to our social being, but then how those manifested into productive outcomes or into interventions or into solutions would be context specific at those places. And that was the idea of band. But again, that's still theater making, theater as social engineering, a whole idea that is not applied theater. And my question is, fine, even if we do something like that, how do we make it ubiquitous? How do we make it so that everyone wants to participate, everyone realizing this, Boal, but Boal, everyone wants to be a part of it, because it's like, yeah, something like that. So I had a few questions. I'll just throw some questions in, but I will ask you guys to just also maybe throw your questions in before we take the conversations further. Maybe we could go around the room a little bit. What would it involve to make theater a part of the everyday social experience? What are the shapes and forms this could take? Where would these points of intervention and dissemination be? How does one take theater maker, producer of cultural product, and turn them into theater processor, theater process master, social engineer? These are the kind of questions that I was starting to have. And also I realized that we're not, theater is already practiced all over the world. Is there a way of taking all of that, and catalyzing it into more? So these are my questions. I would like to deliberately pass this to either Omi or Camille and ask them to then put some thoughts down and pass it on to somebody else, so that we really do have the room speaking to one another. May I ask Omi, maybe?
Sure. I'm happy to throw in some ideas. As I was thinking about, for me, this morning's conversation, since it's 1 o'clock, I think I've been coming at it in a slightly different way. Rather than thinking about how we might encourage everybody to do theater and thereby reap benefits and so on, I actually have been thinking about what is it that theater people do or know or feel or believe that could be useful for everybody, even if they're not quote unquote making theater. So I've been doing some work in a form that some of us call theatrical jazz, and I've set down some elements of that, and it's not an exhaustive list or any of that, but it'll be a jumping off point maybe for this conversation. So things like innovation, improvisation, collaboration, virtuosity, but virtuosity I think of as courage, not just some extraordinary soloist doing their thing, but that soloist has to have the fortitude to step forward at some point. So virtuosity is courage. And then really the starting point for all of it is vulnerability, a willingness to be vulnerable. So those seem to be behaviors or ways of moving in the world that many theater makers engage in. And I get excited trying to think about how to encourage other people to take up those different behaviors.
That's already just the most useful and I think rich point of entry. Because what I'm hearing you naming, Omi, is a need perhaps to think more carefully about what tools we already have in the bag and we move around with all the time, before we think about the uses towards which they might be put. It's just recognizing what's already in our pockets, right? And what we carry on with us all the time. And I like this idea of thinking about how those things might be useful to other people, not even in an instrumental way, but just this jazz innovation, collaboration, virtuosity, and vulnerability are these kind of core philosophical touchstones, if you will, but that are also quite practical in some way. I think it's, eminently rich already.
Good. Exciting.
I just also find myself thinking about watching a jazz person playing and wondering how it could, I look at it and I go, God, that's so amazing. I'll never be able to do that. And therefore I step back from it. Versus is there a way that it could be inviting to say anyone can do this? You just have to, play that first note and we'll take it from there. And I like what Navita has put in with this idea of normalizing courage.
Normalizing courage,
yeah.
The jazz framework metaphor, I guess, for want of a better term, is really interesting because my colleague and I, Jackie Job, we teach, interestingly enough, a first semester course called the Foundation semester. Foundation as in what are the things that students, regardless of whether they're dancers or actors or scenographers or any number of different specialities they might go into, need in order to function as just people in this world called theatre and performance and dance studies. And one of the projects that asked them to kind of explode all their understandings that they've arrived at university with around what theatre and performance are is founded in this idea of jazz as an as a structure to use for improvisation. So in very similar ways, we were also leaning into this idea of innovation and collaboration specifically, but we keyed our process to thinking about jazz participation or the ensemble as a space of careful listening. So you're not listening carefully merely to find the gap where you can then enter, but to enter into dialogue with other instruments, with other voices, and to find the possibilities for, even though we're within a specific structure, we know what we need to achieve musically. We need to play this movement, then move to here and arrive at something called an end point. But that the journey, if we learn to listen carefully, allows us to find these little cul-de-sacs, these little kind of side journeys that you can explore, but always return back to a collective kind of thing in the middle of it all. So I love the idea of jazz as a metaphor for thinking about theatre making, performance making, but also the philosophy behind it. And precisely because of this thing that it is ultimately always already communal in some way, right? Is that you get solo jazz musicians, but the genre, the ethos of the style is ultimately founded in communal improvisation. And I think there's something really powerful about that particular capacity, that tool in the pocket, I think, that performers have, is the ability to respond with quite some agility to things as they play out, but with a view of what the objectives are of engaging in the first place.
It makes me think that's why we actually all kind of pursue art in this world, right? You know, like we've all had access to that, whatever you call that universal flow, right? You jumped into it for a while, you're writing, you link with an idea and all of a sudden you're going, you communicate with somebody, you have a deep conversation and you're going. You both know when you jump off that, I almost think of it as warp speed, right? Like you don't even know where you're going and things are going so fast. And they always talk about it as like a fuse. Something is being destroyed as quickly as being created. And it's like a Mission Impossible fuse, you know, and that always just struck me as something that was always desirable to be in that flow state, whatever, I don't even know if it's called flow state, but whatever it feels like to be in what you appreciate as something virtuosic, right? And however collective that is, or however individual that feels, there's something going on that's anxiety producing while you're there. At the same time, it's the most interesting and kind of wild thing you can feel. And within all that, you know, you always have different notions. Oh, I'm the greatest thing in the world. oh, I'm doing this all on my own. Oh, this is great what I'm doing with someone else. And that could be anything, right? And it just makes me think that's why we all kind of gravitate towards this thing called art, right? And then obviously theater, if you want to share. But it seems like it's such a beacon of light, right? Whether it's literally jazz musicians playing or being on stage and standing up there and all of a sudden, and it always made me think just the difference between writing, like writing for stop signs or writing for promotional things, and then the writing that someone does when they're in that flow state and how it connects with someone else and stuff too. So it just made me think about the notion of virtuosity as an anxiety producing thing for the individual, but when they de-link their ego from that whole experience and become less, it's going to be anxiety producing anyway, but become less connected with the notion of what it's going to do for me. You stop thinking in that simple way, and maybe that's the destruction that happens, right? You stop thinking in that simple way of going after human wants and needs, and you're connecting in some larger way too, magically. Anyway, it's just something I thought about, and I remember just having this thing at LISPA years ago, and somebody said something about confidence or having the confidence to perform or having the confidence to do something to me. And then I remember seeing another girl later on when I was in a different play position, and she looked like she could do a lot of things very virtuosically with ease, and she didn't seem to have a lot of confidence. And it made me think of what confidence is, right? Like that word you use, confidence, to confide. It's a sharing of something, right? It's daring to share something that you have that might link you up with that, whatever that is, that we all kind of desire to be involved in some way too. Yeah, anyway, I'm just running off the mouth, but I just wanted to add that in there. Because I just love the idea of like, hey, I'm going to confide in you. Can I trust you for me to share something with you that will put us into some state that will both benefit from? I guess that's what you do when you get on stage, right? There's a lot of confidence people, in terms of the audience listening and you being the performer.
I think that notion of trust is really important. I think that is part of what makes theater communities. Knowing people long enough, having worked together long enough, that you develop a kind of trust that would make the virtuosity that I'm offering up more available to many people, because you trust that you're being held, that you're respected, even if it so-called doesn't work. There's still people who got you, so to speak. So I think that notion of trust is a real important component in how theater can come together and be strong.
Mm.
I love the notion, by the way, too, of, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you again, but I love the notion of the macro, what do you call it? The photography, it's microscopic and then the macroscopic. So I like the idea of thinking of our futures in 5,000 and 1,000 years, whatever Asimov kind of provoked with this story about foundation and that notion of where we're going to be. I think if you start thinking of yourself as living within that kind of larger framework, I don't do that with the culture I come out of and everything too, but because, as African Americans, my mom taught me to be very good kind of steward of the history of coming from slavery. It's something backward, for sure, right? We go far back, 400 years, to be able to think about what that history looks like and where we're going. And it's supposed to end somehow with Obama and some sort of in some sort of middle class, Black, living room with a big coffee table book with slavery at the beginning and Obama at the end. And that's not satisfactory to me. It's never been, right? So, what do I think about 400 years into the future with and that's a very interesting story, but it seems to involve a lot of wonder, amazement, and deep belief. And I think we're all uncomfortable with belief now that we've all wrestled with, and still wrestling with religion in some ways in our lives, if we have that at all, or the religions that's circling us that seem to be very reductive and oppressive or fascist. So the real courage may be to embrace these things that seem like they're scary, as opposed to secularly useful for us. And then being able to dare ourselves to believe in something, right? As opposed to a useful tool of social things that don't offend anyone, right? Because, you know, you really, I mean, the only way that myths happen is when you break some iconoclastic thing that you thought was so important in your life, right? And the power to break that is what we really get impressed by, you know, the parting of the Red Sea. When you're running from an oppressive force that's trying to crush you, right? They're not going to come and hug you and say, come on back to slavery, we got you when they catch you. They're going to either push you into the water or they're going to destroy you, and, you know, and make your life worse. So there's only one way forward, right? And then all of a sudden the water starts. So I think there's something about that notion of our futures that may be involved, something deeper and scarier. And again, we all feel safer when we talk secularly. But it's interesting what our religion has taught us, even to run from it, right? Because there's too much power in our way. There's too much power chasing. So anyway, it just made me think about that. I mean, I keep trying to think about large things that happen. Large things that are in our way right now can be destroyed, right? You know, and what it makes us feel like when we're involved in that too. And I'm gonna shut up and listen to y'all.
Thank you. Wendy, I see your hand is up. But please, everyone else, like, feel free to weigh in, come on camera if you can, raise your hand, have a kiki with us. MBK. Oh,
I just got all excited to respond. I just have some responses. Yeah, some thoughts to share. When Omi and Camille were speaking, I was thinking about the ways in which theatre work is a kind of art of gathering. I mean, I've also been reading a bit of Priya Parker lately, but there's something that has really struck me there about how true that feels, you know, like, and it's starting to feed more and more into my teaching. That of all of the things that, there's something about how the interrelational, basically, that feels completely fundamental to our work, and something there that feels like in our various processes is always, we return to this thing. We return to a kind of, there's an art of being together. There's a way in which our work practices different ways of being together that can potentially be useful beyond the, you know, creating theatre, obviously, and you know, we know this. So there's something about the kind of interrelational that I just wanted to flag for myself, and then also something about the kind of something perceptual, something about an awareness or an attention that also gets exercised and heightened and developed. You know, if we're talking about, I don't know, principles or like core fundamental things that are, that we maybe take for granted in our practices, at least for me, these are the things that are really sticking at the moment. And something about an attention to something that might be on the periphery, you know, so there's the attention to the things that are directly in front of us that we can, you know, perceive in all of the different ways we perceive, but also this attention to something that is imperceptible in some ways, like it's just outside of reach, just outside, whatever we call it, stepping into the unknown, the, you know, I don't know, intuitive, blah, blah, we have our language for it. But there's something about that also that I wonder if it, you know, I wonder how that kind of attention to something in the summoning world, as it were, as Mary Oliver says, that is just out here, that feels like it broadens a way of being in the world, you know, without getting like vague and philosophical about it. But those things I wanted to just, I guess they're in my mind, and I try to make them part of my teaching that I'm thinking about at the moment. And then I also just wanted to, I love what Camille was saying about mastery and delinking the ego, because they feel like they are incompatible, and yet they're not actually. like an idea of these ideas together just is really exciting for me. And then also of what Omi was saying about trust. I'm in a process at the moment after a very long time on stage. It's fantastic to be held by somebody, but it's made me so aware of the fact that processes can really fuck out. They can really not work, and they can really not be full of trust, and they can really, and I'm only realizing that now because I'm in such a held, trusting, incredibly careful, full of care process. And it's allowing us to plumb emotional depths that on any given day are absolutely and totally unavailable. And there's the level of really precise and intricate trust work it's shocking how deeply affecting it is to be in that process, and what it allows us all to do in this process. So, I feel like that word, we use it, we understand it at some level, but in order for it to be done well, it feels like there's the level of skill and care and understanding of what it looks like in practice, and how to create space for people to do that thing called trust with each other that's a thing on its own, And I think for us potentially, before we are talking about it to people who are not in the fold, as it were, I don't really know what I'm saying, but I guess maybe just reflecting on this process that I'm in at the moment that feels incredibly powerful on the trust level for what it makes available to ourselves as individuals, what it makes available, our own stuff available to us ourselves, and then how we become available to each other on stage, and then of course how that translates to an audience. I'm having a profound trust experience at the moment. So I just wanted to, I guess, put that on the table as well.
Can I quickly respond there, because I think you and I are thinking along sort of similar trajectories. I'm almost sure it was Jill Derlin who wrote a book called Theatre and Utopia, or Utopian Performance, I think that's what it was called, which explores this exact idea that it may be difficult to name what it is, or even to nail down what it is that's happening, but something capacious and potentially transformative happens when we commit to sitting together in a space and sharing space and time together, which is one of the things that I think theatre offers us, is the possibility to create these spaces where, I love how you put it, theatre is the art of gathering, and especially in the context of the past 2 years, right? And going back to what Omi began us with, is this idea of these tools in our pockets, right? And I think it's the capacity to create these spaces where we gather is one of the core and important things that I think we have to offer the world, if you will, is generative ways of being in space and time together, and recognizing that even if it's not necessarily pushed or directed at something that I can call a product, I left with my hand, the fact of sharing space and of being open to that sharing is already one of the utopian impulses that animates performance and theatre specifically. And just a quick other thought in addition to that is that then Jose Munoz also takes up this idea of utopia, but utopian melancholia, right? Is that we sit together, and in seeing the world reflected before us, we also have the opportunity and are often compelled to recognize what the world lacks. So in this image of the world we see, what is it that we desire? What is still wrong? What do we need to work towards fixing in order to reach this, I guess, transcendent or better society that we imagine? So he talks about utopia as a horizon, is that you're constantly moving towards it, but the horizon moves away from you. So to think about utopian performance is to think of a mode of labor, right? A practice that compels us to move constantly towards something that we might never ever reach, because you don't reach the horizon. As soon as you move towards it, it's always just beyond us. So there's something I find really attractive about this as an idea and a concept as well, that theatre perhaps opens up the space in kind of leaning into this art of gathering, is that what drives our gathering and what might emerge out of it is this recognition of these things that we need to do and work on and the compulsion to move forward towards that horizon.
Mhm. Mhm.
Amy?
I really have been loving already so much this conversation we're having, and just I really practice kind of wishing that we were together, because it's easy to forget that we're not, and that is because we're getting better and better at tricking our bodies into feeling what we crave, because we need to have what we need. So we trick ourselves into thinking we're having what we need, because we're getting it sort of visually and sort of through our ears. But this tricking of our bodies, I think is sort of also what I think as theater activators, this layers of the foundation or founders of the foundation or whatever we're doing, is something I think we have to resist. So if I'm thinking about the spaces that you are so wonderfully evoking of the jazz trust space, the shared space, the gathering, I mean, I think it really has to be emphasized that these are spaces of our physical bodies where we're together. Because I think that and I think there's something about theater activation which actually also brings attention to where we are actually located. So to simply bring attention to the physical reality of here and now in a social space is really shocking. So in London, like you can be arrested for incredible things like walking too slowly, walking strangely. You can be, it's just, you can be, people can intervene if you're standing in the wrong position, maybe on top of something, or speaking in a way that is considered strange. I mean, it's so incredible, the interventions that occur around physical bodies. Anything that is deviant, and people can't even specify what it is that they're finding provocative. Like you're talking in a way that we don't talk, or you're standing in a way that we don't stand. Why are you shuffling? It's like the interpretation of the physical space is so thick that that almost anything provokes it. And this is, and more people are fleeing into this safer space where we can easily mute, we can easily go off camera, we can easily retreat. This is safer and safer and safer to this incredibly disciplined physical space-time that we inhabit when we're together. And we are so uncomfortable so much of the time. We're so physically uncomfortable. I went to the actual theater the other day, and my husband and I were just like folded in half. And we were watching, Abel Salaucho, who, is this incredible jazz, classical South African cellist, and you just want to dance. And we were, incredible. And we were folded in half. Everybody in the audience was folded in half. We could barely breathe, let alone sway, move. We were miserable, actually, quite physically miserable. As he was inviting us into a space of gathering, we were all struggling against feelings of profound physical discomfort. And so there's a violation of our physical bodies, which goes against the thing that we are trying. This trust has to also come from a state of physical pleasure. I mean, we've talked about radical intimacy. Already we come to the sort of sense of pleasure, of haptic experience, of hedonism. I love what you say, Camille, about mutual celebration. It's like I'm feeling good about myself, feeling good about you, feeling good about yourself, feeling this kind of feeling good. Is treated so prejudicially. And it's like, this is exactly the thing we need. We need spaces where we are actually physically together and happily physically together. And this, I think, is at a premium. That's really, especially post-pandemic, we're squeezed more and more. That's why I'm so keen on Banyan taking a physical space-time form, because this is partly, I think, what we're defending is the body's experience. So that's my little shadow tirade there.
Can I just say one thing and maybe invite others to also speak? Because I do like, I mean, one of the ideas I thought of was this also another analogy is that, and it was pandemic induced, is that there is a pandemic of thought, there is a drive of capitalism to isolate us, to individualize us to the point of feeling absolutely disconnected from everyone else, disempower us from gathering, disempower us from having these spaces. And so anything about this space or anything about this action, anything about what we're trying to do here is to reclaim our ability to be social beings, is to reclaim our ability to do that. So it's by definition an antidote or a vaccine to the pandemic of thought that is currently afflicting us. And that's what I feel I have that as a response and a thought that we are the vaccine to this pandemic that is stopped us from being social beings who are capable of doing all of this. And the second one is about trust, because I realized that, you know, Omi, we were talking from what you said and what Mania said, trust is built over long periods of time, the same people, you've got this, we hold you, etc. But if you want to, and then I think about what is that in relation to like needing this idea to completely spread like wildfire, which has a sense of speed in it. It has a sense of you know, how do you get a social movement to actually catch and take over? And maybe I calm myself down and go back to Asimov, as Kamali said, and just say no, it'll happen very slowly over millennia. Or I say it needs to catch by wildfire. So what happens if a new person enters a circle of trust? How is the trust that they practice in that circle as valid and as deep or as believable as the rest of the circle that might have been doing it together for 10 or 15 years? Because all of this is also things that build slowly. Everything we talk about in theater builds slowly over time. How do we, then what happens if you want something to catch like a wildfire? So that's another thought I have.
Well, maybe maybe it can build over time, but it let me do this differently. Maybe if everybody on this Zoom were to create gatherings that were the wildfire, then those accumulate, and it may take a long time, but we have an increasing number of people who are engaging in a certain kind of way, a trustworthy way, a courageous way, an improvisational, you know, so for it to catch like a wildfire, maybe we think of time differently, and for humans that the time may seem like a long time, but for other beings in the universe it might be a much shorter time. So I'm just suggesting that we could do it in our pockets around the world, and that would have an enormous impact at some point that many of us in our human forms might never see.
Yeah.
Hey, Jahan, I just really quickly, I know you've talked about this a few times about something catching fire, something kind of getting a lot of eyes or attention on that. I'm very interested in popular attention too. You know, I grew up in movie theaters more than I did in theaters. So I remember the greatest time I've ever had is in Friday the 13th Part 4. It's just a stupid slasher movie, but it had some comedy. It had some child endangerment that was real. And I remember everybody in the audience, there was one guy, he just kept shouting at the theater screen about something. And every time he said it, it was just the right rhythm, right timing. So we all just bust out laughing. So by the time we finished the movie, it was the greatest movie ever. And that was an experience I'll never be able to recapture. I can watch the movie again, but it's something that I had with a packed house for, you know, a slasher movie, you know. So it just made me, it just always made me very obsessed with that notion of what does it mean for us to talk and make sense to a group of people? And then that, whatever that making sense means, gathers a lot more attention. What does it mean to do something incredibly profound in front of a lot of people? And that act get a lot of attention, right? And I think we as people who are fairly subsidized, right, don't get a lot of eyes. We talk about scale, but we could be talking about scale as far as how much we get paid. But we ain't talking about scale as far as a lot of hungry eyes on us a lot of times, right? There's always a small portion of that population that gets fed by us, right? And we always look derisively at slasher movies, right? What gathers a lot of popular eyes, but maybe that's what, whether it's secular or religious, maybe that's what we should focus on, right? Maybe that's what our study should be about. Why do so many people hate Trump? Trump, gathered more people to the Republican Party than ever in life, right? Ever in life, right? On this planet. And so you have to be able to be smart enough to recognize what Trump is doing and what he is as a performer still, right? And you can talk about how dangerous it is, but you also start to have to talk about that power that's being wielded too, and be objective about it in some way too. So it just makes me really very interested in talking more about how you gain eyes and what that power really is involved in gaining eyes and what you do with that once you got it, right? You got a lot of eyes on something. Now what you gonna say? Oh, I'm again, you can get anxiety around that itself, right? You got a million people watching you, a million people listening to you. What are you gonna do with it? What do you believe in? Right? That's a very important thing. You got kids listening to you and you talking nonsense. So it's a very responsible task, and being somebody who's acutely shy and decided to deal with theater, I think I'm dealing with that in my nervous system all the time. I've got all sorts of autoimmune stuff, but something is really important about me being around a lot of people, as Amy was talking about, and at the same time, I need some sort of, in my mind, even if it's just imaginary, it's a delusion. I need some structure around that. Theater offered me that in some ways, right? But I needed to keep deluding myself. Even when I work as, work with the public a lot, I have to constantly delude myself. This is my job. This is what I do. As soon as I get backstage, I can go, because it's tiring and it's attention gathering and it's very anxiety producing. So I just wanted to speak as someone who has actual problems with being around folks and having to be in physical spaces. I hate being in crowds. But at the same time, I love when I'm actually doing something with this crowd. All of a sudden I forget about my body and how uncomfortable I am in my own body and how people are elbowing me or somebody's breathing on my neck. And all of a sudden I'm in some other world. And again, that doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen slow. It just happens sometimes. And again, that creation and destruction thing, right? All those things that I thought I was scared about being in the public space or crowded space, that gets destroyed and something else is happening. But how to get there and what to do about it is another story. So I'll just leave that alone.
Jehan.
I know, but Dominic or Floyd, is there anything you guys feel like contributing, or are you just happy listening in, or just making sure that we've left it open to everybody? I think, okay, just chime in if you feel like it, Dominic or Floyd, Navita. I mean, I know you're doing lots of interactions on the thing, but lovely to hear your voice as well. I think that yeah, Camille, I'm always attracted to the idea of like how do we get lots of eyeballs on this notion, and I think that demagogues and Hitler and Trump and all of these people, they do it by speaking to the lowest common denominator. They speak to our fears. They speak to the negatives that drive us into gathering through othering people, and it's funny, because you hear people who are even mildly informed who go off and support someone like a Trump or a Modi or a Bolsonaro, and they go, yeah, they have their reasons which are more nuanced, and they know exactly what they're supporting despite the fact that they're supporting it. And I don't know if it's like, in whatever our psychohistory is, are we breaking a foundational law of psychohistory that you can only speak to the lowest common denominator? Anyone who tries to speak to a higher common denominator is going to be trumped, literally. God, I can't believe I made that fun, but it works. And so that there is that bit. But then the other thing that I just thought about from your story was this. I think we all have a need to be seen and a need to be heard. I think that's a fundamental universal need as a social being, somewhere, in some form or the other. And so you might be, for example, an introvert or uncomfortable around crowds, but suddenly you're on stage and you love that space because of the rules of it and how it allows you to, in your own way of feeling safe and being seen and heard, was feeling safe maybe. So I don't know. These are just dynamics, because the thing I'm thinking about is also what is the relationship between trust and power. And I put that something up earlier in the chat window about that. But I don't know beyond that. It's just a response that came in. But if there's anybody else who would like to say anything, please do. We are an hour into the talk. It is traditional. We're going to keep the recording going because there's interesting insights and we just like to have this on file. But it is traditional that this talk finishes at an hour 15. Is that right? And then we go to the chat around the water cooler, which will be off. That will definitely not be recorded. But please keep this conversation going. So anything? There you go, Floyd, just jump in.
Okay. I'm very nervous here. I'm a theatre maker of many years, but I haven't been doing it for quite a few years. Various circumstances. I leapt into engaging with teaching in more of a full-time way about 7 years ago. And then the pandemic put an end to that. So I'm in the wilderness at the moment. So it's really fascinating for me to hear you guys all articulating what has always been my greatest passion. I've always said theatre is too important. You have to take it seriously. You can't mess about with it, which doesn't mean not having fun with it. There must absolutely be joy all the time. But let me just sort of see if I can collect a few thoughts about that have popped into my head. I think the greatest, I'm always losing words. Jehan's idea of this grassroots movement taking over the world absolutely fills me with horror, the taking over the world part of it, because you can have, I mean, we've all seen it. I'm old enough to maybe seen it more often than you guys, but so many times a grassroots movement that is literally taken over. Power is very, very seductive and very difficult to avoid. People with the skill of manipulating it, doing what they want with it. On the subject of the virtuosity, immediately I always think back to for music. I managed to swing a music major as well as a philosophy one when I was in my 50s, accidentally. But going through the history of music, this is meant Western music, of course, and thinking, hang on, back in the day, everybody sang. You know, it was just a thing that you did. It didn't matter if you could hold a tune or not. Everybody sang, and as a result, probably most people could hold a tune, because when you start, you know, small babies are listening to music and they're picking it up and they're joining in, and everybody ignores them if they're off pitch, and then gradually it works. But it doesn't mean that there weren't virtuosic singers as well. But then there came a time in Western music history where the virtuosic performer became a thing that if you couldn't do it that well, then shut up. And it was, I blame Mozart, but obviously it wasn't just him. But it kind of started around about that period where the rising middle class, and you had singing around the piano, and then you had but only the good people are allowed to sing, and that really came in with radio, I think. Anyway, but so that's a thing, and that really pisses me off, pardon my French. The other thing is we're all different. You know, we've established that, just talking, you guys talking amongst yourselves, we all feel slightly differently or majorly differently about various things. Jehan was saying when he sees a virtuosic performer, his reaction is, well, I could never do that. I'm the opposite. I see some theatre that's fantastic and I think, oh, let me at it. I want to be that too. I see badly executed theatre and I think, oh my God, maybe I'm that bad. And it actually inhibits me from putting myself out there. So, you know, that's just my peculiar, brain chemistry, whatever you want to call it. Different ways of being together. I absolutely adore that as a concept. Different ways of being together. But I think I'm terribly cynical these days. I don't want to depress you all, but yeah, bring on the children. Thank you very much. Let them find a different way to the way we've been doing it. What I did want, oh yeah, I know. I had the absolute joy and privilege of teaching for 10 months, 7 years ago, in a highly reputed college just outside of London. And the particular campus that I was on, they had 4 different BA strands. One of them, they called it physical theatre. But what they were training these young people to do was to create theatre that had everything, which has been my passion for many years. I grew up with text, Shakespeare, you stand and be a voice beautiful. And then physical theatre came along in the 60s. And I thought, what if we put those out? What if we had it all? And these kids were, and their head of school was training them. And I thought, if only they had great voice coaching. Me, they had fabulous physical, combat, ensemble, solo. They had the opportunity every Friday afternoon to come in front of anyone who wanted to show up, and just put on little 5-minute pieces that they'd made themselves. Those kids are now out there in the world. They're still mostly doing profit share, of course, because who wants to pay for that, you know? Every government, look at the art. Don't get me started on the Arts Council. Okay, I think I've said enough. Thank you very much for listening. Please carry on doing what you're doing.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Floyd. Gosh. I will say that I absolutely appreciate you bringing back, well, not bringing back, but bringing in the kind of music theory critique of Western tonal composition and this idea of the virtuoso, which I think is a very important insight, is this idea that we've moved perhaps as a result of just the kind of, economies of production, if you will, and reception of cultural products has moved us away from a space where you could see everyone's potential to contribute, though to different degrees of, I guess, technical proficiency, but everyone gets to contribute, as opposed to, okay, we'll just sit quietly in the audience and the virtuoso is the one who leads the thing and that's all we consume, which is a closed formation rather than this open-ended one that recognizes that we all might have something to offer. It may not necessarily be tonally pleasing to other people, but it's the fact of being able to contribute that matters.
Absolutely, and that also made me think, well, you can apply the same thing to theatre, because I think of the way theatre is taught in schools, really, maybe it's gotten better than 20 odd years ago when I was last seeing what the school drama curriculum looked like. But again, it's pretty much geared towards finding the virtuosic in there, and doing it that way. Whereas if the skills that you require to make good theatre that communicates, if those skills, of being, understanding how your language works, understanding the skills of communication, of that, I love that. Confidence has always been a don't go there word for me, because it meant, in my mother's words, if you were confident, you were showing off. But that confidence as confiding and sharing, because I think sharing is what theatre is about, and it's what performers, the really effective performers, is what they're doing, is they're sharing, they're inviting the audience to see the world through their eyes for a little moment, if they want to, but there's no compulsion on it, because everybody in the audience has their own stuff going on. Take what you want from what I'm offering you. Here you are, I give it freely. And if those skills could be acquired in the school system, ha ha ha, as if, but still, that's, you know, that's pretty much how I think would be the only way for Jehan's vision to actually have a chance. If worldwide schools all over the world were actually encouraging, facilitating the children to develop what they've already got, their playful, creative nature, and children, you know, I have two very small grandchildren who are just starting to have to learn the skill of sharing. It doesn't come naturally to them, but once they get it, it's, look, mummy, I'm sharing, and the joy that they get out of that is to be facilitated. And you know, you've got to start at the beginning. So you've got to start with the parents. Where do the parents get it from? You've got to start with the schools, etc. I've been juggling that conundrum in my poor little brain for many years. Sorry, I'm going on again.
No, not at all. I had a thought also in relation to that, but that just flew out of my head as quickly as it arrived. Hopefully I'll come back again. Navita, I saw that your hand was up a second ago.
Yeah, hi. I'm thoroughly enjoying listening to all of you for a couple of weeks now, and I've had a very intense and a beautiful relationship with theater. But I'm on the periphery, hence I thoroughly enjoy the thoughts which are going to and fro. Today, what I wanted to say, just share while reading and listening to all of you, is that my response to the discussion is from a person, because I will be the one who will be the watcher. I'll be the one who will be the person who's being part of the theater. I am the one who's, my response is more as a receiver at the moment to the discussion which is taking place. So why are we talking about the whole idea of the courage and the other concepts which were, you know, taking up the spaces, reclaiming the physical presence? And I totally agree with Amy. That is something which is, I think, everybody across the globe is experiencing. I just wanted to just share the thought that all these indicators, all these points can happen beautifully if the person is ready to receive. So can we, I mean, for a minute in my mind, I was thinking, what about the receptivity? It has to be, it can't be one way. When we are thinking of this whole movement and gatherings, it has to be, the gathering also has to be equally receptive to the response. It's just something which was going in my mind, and hence I shared. Thanks.
I feel like what is it that Trump and all of these people are tapping into? And I just know that there has, you know, the pandemic happened. When the pandemic happened, we felt it. When other horrible things recently happened, we felt it. Where there's been a general thought that is, surely we can be better than this. Surely we are better than this. And I don't think that that's a thought that is only going around the left intellectual elite or whoever else you want to vilify or whatever. I think it's a genuine thought that any normal person has. Surely we can do better. And I just feel like if we can tap into that, if somebody can say, we hear you, or if a space or a gathering, a place of gathering, or I say a space, but if a space is there where that idea inside you is heard, then we've got the receptivity cracked. But how do we communicate that? How do we get there when everyone has got these sort of digital techno blinders and everything on? I don't have an answer to that. But I do feel like everyone is hungering for something genuinely better, and not hungering for something that is genuinely better just for themselves.
I hear you.
But I don't know what it is or how to speak to it or how to call out to it for something to happen.
Sorry, Navita, I also cut you off there again.
Sorry, I cut you off too. But no, I in response to Jahan, yeah, the hunger is there, but with this is also the clarity of this is exactly what I don't want to hear, and this is what I do not accept, and this is totally unacceptable to me. And I'm talking, going with the example of Trump and Modi or whatever. That clarity is also important. And once that clarity starts happening, don't you think the energies find and create spaces? I'm just.
So is being clear about what your investments and commitments are, even while committing to open-endedness, is also being clear that this is not good enough for us.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know why we find that so difficult to conceive of ourselves as having the right to even do that. And I think that I certainly always feel as somebody who kind of, works through performance as in some ways, a kind of process of facilitation, always automatically de-emphasize my sense of those sorts of things, right? I know in my head I'm thinking, ugh, I'm not about this life, right? This is not where we should be. But in the interest, perhaps overcorrecting, perhaps, in favor of this open-endedness, and everyone needs to be warm and fuzzy, and we all need to feel equally seen and heard, no matter how toxic the shit we might be saying might be. There is something about being okay with going, no, actually. I hear you, but that's not the journey we're on. And we need to be okay with staking that claim. I think that's a crucial insight for me. That reminds me that I certainly am quite poor at doing that. And maybe that's one of the things we need to give ourselves permission to do with greater regularity and more emphatically.
I wanted to push back a little bit about Trump, because I can't speak to Modi, I can't speak to these other folks who are doing these horrible things in the world right now, both politically as well as just psychologically to our brains. But I also am a storyteller, so I really recognize someone wielding power in a certain way and doing it virtuosically, right? Again, Trump I heard him speak about, I'm going to go back to that beautiful, beautiful White House. You can hear the people cheering and everything. And again, what he's speaking to is a fox in a hen house, right? He still speaks to those people in 2015 who felt abandoned by Obama, abandoned by Clinton, because they weren't heard in these little enclaves, right? And he said, I'm going to be the fox in the hen house, and I'm going to clear out. And again, it's the idea that anybody could be in that White House and start whipping people into shape and all this other stuff. I'm going to be slicker than everybody else. If you can create that myth about yourself, and you can fool people into thinking you're going to be able to overturn power, which is the most important thing, right? People got screwed in 2008. Millions of families were out in the street, and nobody got punished for that housing thing, right? That was it was just on the eve of Obama getting into it. For the next 8 years, nobody got punished, and 1 million families went in the street. So that's a power dynamic, right? And so if Trump fools people into thinking he can do something about that, and then he's coming back in his second term, and now it's just about mischief making, right? I don't even care about anything, because clearly for the last 4 years, I didn't do anything. But now I'm still going to mess up stuff for everybody else so that nobody gets to play anymore. That's something that if nobody feels invested in anything anymore, I'm going to go after that. That's going to be my hero. And again, I think if we are too high-minded that we can't hear that thought, and again, the way in which it's a performer, right? It's a performance. I am the fox in the hen house, and I'm going to tell you how beautiful it's going to be when we're there. You guys are going to share in my victory. Again, that's stuff that you can do as a performer. Every single one of us can do, and it's a very scary thing. But obviously, when you got millions of dollars, you got a little head start. But that's what I'm saying. It's not just something where it's not Hitler going, and then we're supposed to go, I'm so objecting to this guy's way of performing. No, he's seducing people, right? And he's seducing powerless people, sometimes people who feel like they're helpless, if not completely helpless. And again, that's where I really want to push back on. this is all about performance, y'all. Ain't nobody saying anything that's going to actually happen the next day, right? It's all about, I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to try to push this giant bus and maybe it'll move, right? When we talk about politics. And so when you start saying, no, this bus is going to move and everybody's going, yeah, this bus is moving. It's a miracle that's happening, just like the parting of the Red Sea. And if we're not aware of that, we're not aware of those, I mean, as theater people, we got to be aware of those dynamics, right? Because what else are we looking at when we're paying attention to a power wielder, you know, who's getting people to do things that we can't do ourselves, right? So that's what I mean. Like, it's really important to recognize those dynamics too. I mean, again, we can be objective about it. We're not religious people. We're not saying that person is too far gone, he's satanic to me. We're people who are supposed to be secular. So we can actually look at something and go, no, that person is performing now, and this is how the performance works. I think it's our duty to be able to do that, at least be able to recognize that. And if we want to mimic it or mock it later, that's fine. But first, recognize what's happening, because that's how people, again, might be a small portion of people in our minds, to the people we hang out with. But there's somebody who's thinking a certain way, or who's feeling more disempowered than we even know. And I think that's really important to recognize too, that this is a dangerous game we're playing. And again, that's why it keeps going into this religious conversation, right? Because I think what Floyd said, she knows what happens when people talk about grassroots power, getting some power, and all these other things happening, right? There could be horrible things that happen. The Cultural Revolution in China, according to who you talk to, was a horrible thing or a great thing, right? So what are we talking about when we talk about trying to make something really happen that could potentially kill people or damage people psychologically, at the same time, free people up? Because that's what happened in the Cultural Revolution. So we got to remember that too, right? I mean, again, there was a lot of people who felt really, really empowered when Trump won, and even while he was in the presidency, because he was talking stupid, you know? And nobody's ever talked stupid in the White House before. And that makes a lot of people feel empowered. And again, if we don't recognize that, we miss a whole power dynamic that's really a part of performance that we missed out on, because we ain't getting those millions of numbers and millions of eyes looking at it. And so just recognize that and be brave. We can be scientific. We're grown-ups. You know, we can look at people and go, that's not satanic. This is what's happening, right? And I think that's really important to recognize too. That's what I'm gonna say. I'm only saying this because I'm recording it. We want to keep this on for posterity. But it's really important to recognize whatever Trump is.
Thank you. Sorry, just briefly on that subject, I just want to point out that it's an hour and 25 we're in, so we're going to stop recording at this point, but I'm hoping that it doesn't mean that we stop the conversation. So let's carry on, and then people can duck as and when they need to.
And thank you all for being here and participating in this.
It's been amazing. I wanted to